convergence, Mr. Scott Modis.
Oh yes, yep.
Yes.
Yeah,
He's on the.
Scott. Yeah, he may know more about the Lake Champlain Monster and Loch Ness research than anybody else I've known.
Oh yeah. I mean, Scott. How can I describe him? He walks that fine line between skeptic and believer perfectly,
Hmm.
and manages to stay friends with everybody in every camp, and that's an achievement in this genre.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
You know, if anything, that's the one thing I'd like to learn a little more from him, or some of those tightrope walking skills, which are very admirable. So
Right.
I wanted to just catch up with you, and chat with you. I'd heard of you before, of course I'd heard of you, but I actually had a book of your brothers,
Right.
and that's how I first came to know the name. And I saw Small Town Monsters, Beast of Whitehall, etc. And I just thought, well, okay, this is great. This gentleman knows a lot about this. And of course, there's the book with yourself and Robert, Bigfoot Encounters in New York and New England,
Right.
from 2008. And I thought, okay, this is a great chance to catch up on that subject. Not a lot of people think about there being a Bigfoot presence in the Adirondacks or in New York
Absolutely.
State. I mean, why would there be Bigfoot there? Surely this is this is Washington State, Pacific Northwest. What is it doing there? So, how about just filling us in a little bit on your start? What intrigued you? You know, what brought you into the Bigfoot genre in your part of the country?
Right. As you said, when you watch the documentaries of that time period back in the 70s and so forth, they kind of looked at Bigfoot phenomena as being Pacific Northwest in the United States. Generally California, Washington State, Oregon, up into British Columbia, Canada, that general location. So living in New York State, we had a major incident here back in 1976, which involved several law enforcement agencies. And so that got us to look at New York State a little more closely. And back in 1978, there was a book written by John Green, Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us. And in it, I think they logged something like 11 or 14 cases in New York State and a few in Vermont. And so we basically put that under a microscope and began researching, and we found out that there were actually hundreds in this region. And the history of it is what's so rich. You can go back to the Algonquin and the Iroquois and their legends of stone giants or giant men of the mountains, the Kikuchi, the Wendigos, the wild men of the 1800s. So there's a real rich history in the Northeast that was often underlooked and overlooked. And so we were able to sort of delve into that and bring it to the forefront.
Well, it's interesting to me. Now, I'm currently writing Beasts of North America. Beasts of Britain was my first book. I'm looking at various beasts around North America as a geographical area, but of course the US as well. And it's shocking. I mean, it's really shocking, the widespread presence of Bigfoot sightings, for want of a better word. Now, are you involved in Bigfoot research just in that particular area? Is that your area of interest, or do you look at sightings across the country? Because one of the things that astonished me when I visited the US for the first time in 2018 and took 9 or 10 different flights through different areas that I did not perceive to be well forested. And as I was flying into Atlanta at some point and landing, I just looked over this sea of trees that stretched on as far as the eye could see, and just thought, this is Atlanta? I mean, you could hide anything in that little, as it was described to me by somebody, in that little stretch of forest. Of course, in the UK, we're not really used to forest on that sort of magnitude. Now, when you talk about the Pacific Northwest and you consider that to be real, pristine forest, well, then what's Atlanta? You know, what's New York State?
Right.
What's New Jersey? we never think of those places as being heavily forested. And yet, wow, I was in Vermont, I was in New York State for a little while too, on the Lake Champlain side. And even around these areas, it was just countryside as far as the eye could see. So what's not to like about the Bigfoot phenomena, I suppose, being widespread? What's your opinion on that?
You're absolutely right. Just 10 miles south of Albany is a little place called Kinderhook, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Bruce Hallenbeck had been researching the Kinderhook creature. And you think, my goodness, Albany, New York? And, it's only 10 miles from Albany, and yet it looks a lot like Whitehall.
Uh-huh.
Because there's just so much forest land. The Adirondacks is a huge amount of forest land. And it's so much so that a while back when the 2 prisoners escaped from Dannemora prison, became a very famous case over here, they were on the loose for just over 2 weeks. And really what got them caught, even though we had modern technology of tracking dogs and helicopters and infrared and, information, social networks, everything out there trying to capture them, what really got them caught were their own mistakes. They were in areas that were so primitive that they could have easily, if they hadn't made mistakes, maintained being hidden. Mm-hmm. So it just goes to show you how dense some of that area is, and how even using the most modern technology, we really needed them to goof up to catch them.
Now that's an encouraging thought, for the criminals at least. I suppose what got them caught is the same thing that got them caught in the first place.
Yeah,
like a preparedness. Absolutely. And thinking out the escape route and the crime. Now, I mean, in regards to your research, obviously you've been at this a long time. I know that you worked with Joe Zazinski a bit at Lake Champlain also, is that right?
Yep.
Over the years. And it just seems that the area that you're in, I spent a little time there, it's rich with sightings. And that whole borderline East Coast. I even talked to a famous, I forget his name now, who's a head of a paranormal society in the US, or some sort of fortune society. Anyway, I forget his name. It's in New Hampshire. And he took us to his house and described to us what he could only think of it as being a tatzelworm sighting. A long, very black-like, snake-like creature that shot off and burrowed into the side of a railway siding back in the 70s. He was pretty matter-of-fact about it. I mean, yes, he's a fortune researcher. He's into the paranormal and the supernatural and the rest of it. You could say he's got a vested interest in the strange and unusual. But, this was a long, long time ago when I guess his interest was somewhat smaller. And that's something I've never heard of. I mean, surely the tatzelworm, this is a Swiss phenomenon in Europe, right? So I'm very interested to know, from your experience anyway, are there other things in this area apart from Champ or the Beast of Whitehall or similar other Bigfoot and Lake Monster-like sightings? Are there other cryptids there?
Certainly. John Keel, who wrote, the Mothman Prophecies and, various paranormal and 14 books, was a fellow New Yorker, and he talked about, I think it was the Silver Lake Monster and all sorts of various creatures. And he talked about the bilious boogeymen of the Adirondacks. And he said that Plattsburgh, New York, which is, a couple hours from here, was a window area. That's what he called it. And those were areas that different types of 14 phenomena would occur, whether it be of a cryptozoological nature or a ufological nature. Very interesting phenomena. And I got a great respect for John Keel. He and Brad Steiger had researched this type of phenomena back in the 60s and early 70s, back before a lot of people were really aware of just how layered some of these reports and some of this phenomena is. And then we got a chance to see that firsthand with some of the reports over here in New York, where they look like typically it may be a UFO phenomena or it may be a creature phenomena. And then when you start peeling away the layers, you start to see a pattern where there's different phenomena occurring here. And we'll see this over and over again. So the idea of a UFO flap, a creature, a Bigfoot flap, sometimes it might be more of a paranormal outbreak than just a specific type of phenomena.
So what's your opinion on that? As somebody that's really been looking for an undiscovered ape or something of that kind in North America, do you think there's a crossover, or do you think that perhaps some environments are just conducive to a variety of hidden phenomena, for want of a better word, and UFOs and Bigfoot and orbs and lake monsters? Perhaps there's just good topography to hide certain things that would like to stay out of sight. Does that ring true to you, or do you think there's something a little more paranormal going on here in general?
I think the slogan that is kind of attached to me is there's something else going on here. And that seems to be what comes up a lot.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you an incident. We had the creature outbreak on Avail Road in Whitehall, New York, back in August of 1976.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, we had several police agencies who had encountered a creature out on Avail Road. Initially, I'll give you a brief synopsis. You had 3 teenagers, and they sighted a creature. They sped into town. They alerted the authorities. Authorities responded. We had Washington County Deputy Sheriff. We had Whitehall Police out there. We had New York State troopers. So they all converged. And over a week-long period from August 24th to September 1st, we had maybe as many as, 12 to 14 separate sightings, and maybe even more. So of this large creature. The creature was described as being about 7 to 8 feet tall, having dark hair, having red eyes, walking bipedally, 2 legs swinging its arms, and making a sound like a woman screaming or a pig squealing. Seemed to be very much afraid of light. So, initially that was reported in the Post-Star, which is a local paper in New York, and it was reported as officers track creature. Well, on the Vermont border, they talked about UFOs connected with the sighting as well. That was not even mentioned in that. And it come to find out that this was during a major UFO flap in which UFOs were sighted all in this region, all throughout this region. So we know that was layered in. It was a major UFO flap that went all the way down to New York City area. So you also start to layer in these big bird or pterodon or, whatever you want to call them, pterodactyl sightings. And we had a sighting of that as well. So you just don't know what to make of all this. So my job as a researcher is to record this as accurately as possible, because later on it may form a pattern and it may start to show something that we may have overlooked. Now, one aspect, excuse me just a second.
That's okay. I'll take an opportunity for one of those too.
Now, one aspect that initially we didn't understand was that when I interviewed Bob Martell, who was the Whitehall police dispatcher, it used to be the greatest job ever. You'd be overnight at the police station, usually watch TV, answer a couple calls. Terrific job. Well, Bob said that one night, and he said he could never remember whether it was a week before or a week after the Avail Road creature sightings. There was a sighting of something landing on someone's lawn in the town of Whitehall.
Wow.
Seems completely absurd because we're not talking about a rural area. We're talking about houses everywhere. And it was on the avenues. And so I was able to confirm through the witness that something came down and landed. It left a circular swirl in the grass, and then it took off. Well, Bob Martell and Police Sergeant Wilfred Goslin at the time, they decided they're only 2 streets over. So they drove right to the spot and they talked with her. and she didn't want to, go further with the investigation, but she confirmed that something landed. And Bob said there was this circular patch of matted down grass. And he said he reached down and he could still feel the heat coming off of the grass.
Wow.
So we look at this incident happening in conjunction with the UFO flap in this area and the creature outbreak all occurring with the big bird sightings. And you start to see these layers that John Keel and Brad Steiger had talked about back in the 60s. You start to see it firsthand. So turns out that there was a similar incident like this that happened in 1973 at the La Cabana restaurant on Glen Lake, New York. And what had happened is Jack Bergeron was the owner of the restaurant, and he had been away. And when he returned, there was a circular patch of dirt that had been swirled in the parking lot of the La Cabana. And the dirt had been thrown against the door of the restaurant. They had to get a shovel to shovel away the dirt. There was so much dirt thrown there. So you try to explain that, you really can't. They heard strange noises and all this, and you think, what would have landed and left that? We have no idea. But it was two concentric circles.
Was it large circles?
Yeah, about between 12 and 20 feet.
Well, that's quite big.
And there's a famous picture of Jack Bergeron pointing to the object, the circle in his parking lot. Well, come to find out, you can make up explanations. Well, I remember the most absurd one was somebody said, somebody took a motorcycle and spun, circles. It's completely absurd. So there was a physical effect that we didn't realize. And what had happened is the hot water taps ran cold and the cold water taps ran hot. And we couldn't explain that. And it happened, and it stayed that way for, I think it was several weeks. Wow. And then it reverted back to normal. Now, there was a scientist I talked with, and he says, that could have been an electromagnetic field that had reversed the polarities on the valve. And that's a possibility, because that's an odd effect. That's something you can't just hoax. That's an actual physical effect that something had happened there.
And I would assume that a plumber couldn't have easily just got in and changed that. This is part of the system itself. The ordinary workings of that tap system, they shouldn't be able to switch.
Right.
It's hot to cold and cold to hot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you what was fascinating is that that sighting got reported, and then you start to hear other reports of similar type rings in the area that have been reported. And this is exactly the phenomena that was reported in Whitehall at the same time, except that was connected with an object landing and taking off. So you start to see these patterns form, these strange phenomena. And to this day, the La Cabana has never been adequately explained. Only that I think with the added investigation that showed that the water taps had changed indicates that that's a legitimate case. It's not somebody out hoaxing.
Yes, definitely. Now, let me ask you this question in regards to that. And with this convergence, this layering of different cryptid sightings and possible UFO sightings and the like, when people come up with explanations for it, and you must encounter this a lot. Now I've read some of your work, read some of Robert's work, and clearly there is a clinical, very objective slant on the research that you guys do, and I really like that a lot. I can't claim that much myself, but I'm aware of my own bias, at least. I do try to work against it as far as I can. But people obviously have, in cryptozoology these days, almost a pseudo-religious belief system attached, or at least a philosophical belief system attached to the cryptids that they're interested in. And that definitely tends to dominate their explanation of phenomena. How do you deal with that? I mean, when you're dealing with people that want to believe sticks and stones, for example, and that little documentary that are made by Bigfoot without really checking around for tracks or hair or anything around these giant structures. How do you deal with that? Or that somebody would immediately assume that UFOs made the circular indentations in the ground. What's your rebuttal to those types of claims? Or or do you think everything's up for grabs?
Well, you make a good point. To some people, this is almost a religion,
Mm-hmm.
and they want to believe. They desperately want to believe. And generally speaking, when it comes to a legitimate sighting, we classify eyewitness sighting, track find, or vocalization report. That's pretty much how we take down the information. And some people just want to believe, and you'll start to hear things like, I was pretty sure somebody was following me. I could sense something was there, but there isn't really a sighting, an actual sighting there.
Yeah.
So they may be an incident, you take down the information, you log it, and maybe it means something later, but I don't regard that as a sighting.
No.
When you have a sighting, it's a life changer. It's a game changer, and it's not necessarily a positive thing. Mm-hmm. Dan Gordon was a Whitehall police officer, my neighbor in Whitehall here. And Dan, for 22 years, he had a sighting and couldn't talk about it because he was a police officer. And it took a long time. It was a process for him to finally come out and explain what he had seen. And he had seen a creature cross the road in front of him, a Bigfoot type creature. And they were on routine patrol, he and another police officer. And they had turned around and come back into town, and the creature crosses the road in front of him. He gets out of his car, parks it, gets out, draws his weapon, tries to follow with a flashlight. Creature's long gone. Gets back in the car. His partner stayed in the car, actually swallowed his tobacco that he was chewing. And, it's like, that was some deer. That was no deer. I know. And so both of them were just stunned by what they had seen. And they couldn't talk about it for so long because of that ridicule factor. They didn't want to be known as the Bigfoot cop or whatever. So to them, they didn't want to experience this. They just happened to experience it. And for them, it was a life-changing event. And it wasn't positive. It was a negative. So I look at those types of sightings with an even higher credibility because it's something that they didn't want to happen. It's something that they didn't invent or try to draw parallels to. It happened to them, and it changed them.
I mean, I suppose you would call them antagonistic witnesses. Essentially, they're antagonistic witnesses. They're unwilling witnesses.
Starting to lose your hair.
High traffic. So, in regards to what you're saying, regarding the police officers and this reticence to talk about sightings, I love those antagonistic witnesses. Those witnesses that would rather not have seen what they saw, but cannot deny what they know to be true. And that's a wonderful,
right?
That's a really, really wonderful thing to have as a researcher, right? As a researcher, what a boon. I had a witness here in the UK.
I knew Dan.
Oh, yes. We're losing each other again. So you say you knew this guy?
Yeah, I knew Dan from school. Very honest, straightforward, straight shooter. And so Dan says to me one day, we're walking up the road, and he goes, I want to take a polygraph. And I said, Dan, nobody's asking you to take a polygraph. And he says, I want to. And so we got in touch with, back then it was the Monster Quest show, Doug Hijack production.
Yeah.
And they had come up to do a New York episode. And they had interviewed for their Gigano special, which was really the premiere of that show. That's what spawned that show. Dan was interviewed. So they came back and they decided to give Dan a polygraph with a couple other people. And the polygrapher was a state polygraph expert that they used in criminal cases. And he came up and he said there was no deception with Dan Weber.
Wow.
This is a difficult dilemma because you want to say, well, maybe they just saw an animal cross and that it was common, but they didn't see it that way. Well, no, now you've got 2 police officers that saw the creature. Well, maybe Dan was exaggerating. Dan passed a polygraph and was very hesitant about even coming forward. So this becomes a problem for the a skeptic to explain away. This isn't an easily explained case, and it's one of those that's got high credibility. And if you knew Dan, you would know that this was a real incident, and that he wouldn't make something like that up. So all those skeptical standby arguments you can just throw away. And so we really have to look at the information and look at the case. And it was in February of 1982. And they said that the creature was tall, slightly hunched over, swinging arms at its knees, and that it traversed the road in 3 steps.
Classic.
And that is, yeah, and it's the most common roadside, type road cross sighting. My brother is 6'1", 6'2", and he tried to duplicate with giant steps, crossing a road that was even smaller than that main road. And he took, about 6 steps, 6 to 7 to get across there. So for something to cross it in 3 almost brings it out of the normal human category.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I love that classic, the 3-step road sighting. It's always a signature move. And something I'm interested in asking you about, actually, when you talk about this convergence and this layering and just looking at the evidence as it presents itself and trying to honestly report it without making assumptions or coming to conclusions. Often I find myself as a researcher having to justify my interest in something. So even though I don't believe in it, it stretches the parameters of what I'm willing to accept. So, for example, I'm very comfortable with Bigfoot, not so much with Dogman. Because for Bigfoot, I can stretch into some sort of plausible Gigantopithecus theory or Neanderthaloid, survivor, even though there's not really much to substantiate that either. But there's something in the fossil record that makes me feel comfortable. When you look at a Dogman or a werewolf, let's be honest, the werewolf rebranded is the Dogman, isn't it? Well, what could that possibly be as a creature? Now, a lot of people immediately jump into the paranormal realm. But I'd say that's just us placing a supernatural presence upon something we don't yet understand. As if we saw in the ancient past that we were one of the people to first notice an octopus camouflage or a squid change color or whatever. It would seem like a magical power of some kind, whilst we couldn't explain it. So is this creature, this Dogman, just a creature that we can't explain? Or do you have an opinion? Does it stretch into the supernatural realm somehow? Is this just a way that we have always tried to make ourselves comfortable with that which we don't understand?
Well, I'll approach that from a different angle. I like the way you approach that. If we look at some of these reports, for instance, let's take Cliff Sparks, who had a sighting here in Whitehall at his golf course back in 1975 in May. And Cliff was out on the greens, tending the greens at night. And he went out to green number 1, which has a clump of trees next to it. And when he did, he said he drove his cart up. There was a creature standing on the green. And he said he was startled. And the dog that rides in the cart with him, which usually gets off the cart and runs around, just whimpered down and stayed right in the cart as the creature looked at him. And he said he thought the creature was as scared of him as he was of it. Now, he described this thing as being sloth-like, about 7.5 feet tall, moving sloth-like. He said it had hair and was a conical-shaped head and long swinging arms. But he also said that it had red, glowing eyes. And when I asked Cliff about the eyes, he said it wasn't reflective. It wasn't like hitting a raccoon's eyes with a flashlight and getting that eye shine. And I had mentioned this at a conference one time, and a couple of the researchers, that's just eye shine. Cliff had been around, and he knew what eye shine was. He said this was different. He says it was like, and this is an exact quote, he said it was like short dots coming out, like rays. Very unusual.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm going to make up a story, I'm certainly not going to say that. And yet Cliff said that this was the thing that stuck with him. And he didn't go back out there at night anymore after that incident.
No.
And this was a year before the Abear Road incident.
Wow.
And Cliff we're talking just, we're talking very close to the creature, within 20 feet of the creature. And he said that the creature was more concentrating on his dog than he was on him. And he said those rays were shooting right at the dog. And he said the dog
literally coming out.
He said he could see like short dots, they looked like. They were emanating. Now, he said that the dog just slumped over the cart. And he said that was completely uncharacteristic. And, Cliff he never changed his tune about that aspect of the story. And that stuck with him.
Mm-hmm.
And he made it quite clear that it wasn't eye shine. So when I say there's something else going on here, that's what I'm getting at. When you start to peel the layers away, you start to get this characteristic. And when you look at the literature, you will see characteristics that are reported from should say hundreds of years ago, not that ancient, in which they'll say it had eyes like glowing embers. And it's a different vernacular describing that same phenomena. And it doesn't quite fit into what we would expect. And I think these are really important aspects to really focus on and start to record, so that maybe this means something down the road.
I wonder, it seems to be an obvious place to go to, but some sort of infrared,
some sort of night vision.
Some sort of night vision, perhaps, who knows? I mean, it's not an original theory, of course, and many people have postulated that, I'm sure. Now, I've heard lots of tales of cryptid-like creatures having some sort of bioluminescence in their eyes. The yowie in Australia is often reported as having this feature. The owlman of Mornin here in the UK, although I'm not completely sold on that sighting, based upon the possible source for it, it would be, I think, personally, Tony Doc Shields, the famous conjurer who's so involved in Loch Ness, who was collecting these sightings. Anyway, that was often purported to have these red glowing eyes, almost like a Mothman type creature, really, based around that time. It seems to be an odd feature. And I often wondered, would being able to produce your own light, if you're a nocturnal creature, surely that has some sort of evolutionary benefit. And is that what we're looking at? And when the ancients or the people, our forebears, saw these features, well, that's like hellfire, isn't it? The wolf had hellfire in its eyes. And as you say, or dots of fire, pinpricks of fire. And yet we may live long enough to have the discovery and find out what actually this biological creature, specialized to hunt and feed and live at night, has adapted somehow and has these very beneficial features. And that always tweaks my interest. And even with ghost stories and the rest of it, I always try to think, what natural explanation could this have, really? That and not just to limit myself to the natural explanation, because that's a prejudice in itself, right? Those are blinkered views in themselves. But what explanation could there be, Dogman?
Right.
Okay, do we have any creature that could have come from a dog? Is it an ape of some kind that has a pronounced snout? Or you mentioned a sloth-like appearance to this recent sighting. Is it a giant sloth that's a nocturnal creature that essentially, up close to a stranger at night, could look like a big wolf? Some people have even mentioned kangaroos, loose kangaroos. If you see one of those in the middle of New York State at night, that would give you a fright. A big kangaroo.
I can remember back in the 70s, we had some kangaroo sightings in New Jersey, which was pretty unusual. With the red eyes, one of the slides that I use at my talks is the one by Janet and Colin Board. The book Alien Animals is their cover, and it's got all the different cryptozoological creatures. They all had the red glowing eyes.
Right.
So I love that cover, and I think at this point, as a researcher, my primary focus is to take down the information as accurately as possible, even if it doesn't seem to fit, and to not try to draw conclusions, but to just report and document. And that's what we've been doing for the better part of 40 years. And the funny thing is, like I said, this layering effect, when you look at something that looks like it's going to be a straightforward creature sighting, and then you have one of the witnesses had a poltergeist outbreak within a day of the sighting. They had the big bird sighting and things like that. It kind of points in a different direction, that there's something else going on here. And, maybe we'll never fully understand it. Maybe it's, some of the research that's being done right now, like at Skinwalker Ranch, pretty fascinating stuff. And we may be on the edge of a new concept with quantum physics and, things that seemed impossible years ago don't seem all that off base now.
Yeah, and we're definitely in a stage in technological discovery that makes the impossible seem general.
There's a lot more plausibility now with the quantum physics and discovery of dark matter, and there's a lot more doors that are being opened now. And you listen to people like Michio Kaku, talk about quantum entanglement, and it just blows my mind. Yeah,
that generally tends to confuse me, but it's outside of my scope of interest, generally speaking. Now, what I'm most interested in about cryptozoology, actually, that I've been following the creature sightings all of my life. I'm 44 years old, and so reasonably young teenager. I was collecting every sighting I could get hold of. But what interests me more these days, since my sort of crash test dummy descent into career cryptozoology, is the psychology of belief, the psychology of fandom, and all of the attributed, how can I put it, all of the attributes that people latch onto. And we spoke about it a little bit earlier. And sometimes I think that some of the veracity of rebuttal and refutation and arguments and the tribalism that goes on, it is very belief-centered, but it also seems to be filling some sort of religion-shaped hole. Now, that's not to say that everybody should have religion, but that was once all of our society, and now we don't have it. There's lots of holes left. And if you believe in Bigfoot, I posted the other day, just as a bit of a taunt. I don't know if you remember the film Salem's Lot, the original film.
Love it.
I love it too. And there's a scene where he puts the two tongue compressors into a cross and he places it down on Marjorie Glick's forehead. And there's a GIF online where she's just steaming. And I just posted my reaction. Everybody tells me, every time somebody tells me they believe in Bigfoot. And I received some major kickback about that for about 6 or 7 days. And I deserved it because I put it out there. And somebody said to me, I thought you researched Bigfoot. Surely you believe in Bigfoot. I said, I researched it and I'd love it to be true. And there's lots of plausible evidence, but I don't believe in it.
Right.
It's not my religion. And that was the point. I was just kind of prodding a little bit and saying, come on, let's think about the way we look at these things. And one of the big examples I like to use is when Cortez, when he approached the shores there, and Moctezuma and all of the Aztecs, when they saw the ships coming, they thought they were floating mountains. And they don't look like mountains, but the mind immediately made up the most familiar shape.
Right.
They could envision, and there were these floating mountains coming, and he imagined Cortez to be Quetzalcoatl returning from the east, and sure enough, it led to the destruction of their society, which is not very funny, I know, but it's amazing how perception can really dominate how we interpret data.
human perception definitely plays a big role in this. And I love that approach that you're talking about, because I come across that a lot with people who just want to believe. And this has become sort of a religion to them. And I really caution against staying away from that. And, you know, you got to really stay with the facts and the science behind it, and record the evidence and look at it later. And, you know, a tiny detail like that red eyes didn't really mean like, you know, make a lot of sense back then, and making more sense now that there's something else going on. And, you know, some researchers might take that report and not even talk about the eyes because it doesn't fit their established parameters of what they feel this is. And, you know, that's just not science. You know, it's funny, you had mentioned belief. There was a movie back in, I think it was 76, 77, called Sasquatch. It was more of an action adventure family type oriented film, but they had a great silhouette of a creature and in the dark forest around it, and the creature standing there. I always loved that silhouette. It was a great picture. And I found a sign that had that silhouette. It was the reverse image put on a metal sign. And I'm looking at it and I go, hey, that's great. But then they put a slogan about believing on it, and it just ruins the whole sign. I actually took black paint and painted it off, and the sign looks awesome now.
But it's your sign.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
that's great. You didn't just vandalize the sign. No, that's not going to happen.
No,
that's going.
I bought the sign great. And I just blacked out the saying.
And the first bit I missed. Better. Yeah, I'm sure it does. The first bit, Paul Bartholomew was just going around correcting Sasquatch signs all around the country, because that just won't do. You can't believe this. Look, I think it's very, very plausible. I was lucky enough to meet Jeff Meldrum when I went to Lauren's conference in 2018, and we're all sitting around just basically at dinner talking about stuff, and somebody brought up Todd Standing, and I didn't want to mention it to him, because in fact when I met Jeff that day in the lift, being a bit of a fanboy, I thought, oh, just be cool. Don't mention Todd Standing. Whatever you do, that's your mission today. Do not mention Todd to Jeff, because I'm sure he's sick of that stuff. And I didn't. But sure enough, you know, we got to the table later, and we were all eating, and somebody brought it up. And I said, "Oh, I'm sure you don't want to talk about it." He said, "No, I'm cool to talk about it. I don't mind." And I mentioned to him that I'd had a friend of my wife's who was one of the head of VFX for The Hobbit movie, and Walter Mitty and Noah and a bunch of other big Hollywood movies. So she understood it really well. That's her business. And I was to review the Discovering Bigfoot movie, just specifically these creatures that he presented, and said, you know, you don't care about Bigfoot, but you understand effects. Can you tell me, could this be done? Could this be faked to this degree? And how would they do it? And she said, yes, it could be faked, but actually looking at the first two creatures, this very blondie type creature, the other one they call it Teddy Squatch, the Blinky, or whatever that other one was, she said, you know, you can see that actually the makeup would actually have to go under the eyelids with full contact, and it would be very, very painful. So that's not to say it's not faked, but whoever did it did a really good job. And I mentioned this to Jeff, and he said, you know, Todd's not very likable. He's not a likable guy. But I went out there with him in the woods. He was a great woodsman. I can't comment on his evidence as being real or fake. His wife's, they say, is a makeup artist, but she's just a beautician. I wasn't a big believer in Todd, but I thought, yeah, you know, people's perception, and actually sometimes what notable persons in this genre say about other people will affect the way you feel about them forever. Ended up writing a blog about it, which was called, I think, Standing Alone, All on His Todd. You get the reference. Yeah, cheesy. But yeah, it was interesting. But I mean, what's your take on that type of evidence? I feel we're stuck, like all the Patterson Gimlin footage, we're almost stuck in a position where if it's too good, it can't be real. And if it's too blobby, then of course it's just it's inadmissible. So how do we get something that satisfies the Bigfoot community as genuine evidence, or is it dependent upon the stature of the person who presents it?
Yeah, it presents a real conundrum. The problem, you see, I used to think that maybe some hairs and a little DNA, and we'd solve this, and that became even a bigger problem.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure where it's going to go. I think the only way you would be able to really fully solve this would be with a body. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't look like there's just elements here that don't add up to that for me. Uh-huh. And I'm not sure where that's going. I'm open to everything. I would love it if tomorrow someone found a body and, we hail, CNN and all the news groups, and everybody has an independent study of it. But it seems like there's something else going on here. And I don't know exactly how we really explain that away. There's definitely a human perception going on here, an element that has commonalities of human perception, and I don't know if we're ever going to have that day. Where I'm much more at ease with something like the catamount, that's not supposed to exist in this area, as being a physical flesh and blood creature. This has elements to it that bother me. And, I wish it wasn't that way. It'd be a lot easier if it wasn't. But as a researcher, my job is to lay it out. And, that's the way it is.
Well, you do it wonderfully. And it's wonderful to get your take on the whole thing. Just before we finish up, is there somewhere where people can find you? Are you attending conferences, if there are any conferences this year, eventually, at some point in the future? Any documentaries, anything coming up?
Yeah, we have a festival in the fall here in Whitehall, and that's in the last week of September, the last Saturday in September. And best of my knowledge, we're still on schedule, but, obviously with the pandemic, things been pushed back and altered, so I don't know if that says. As far as I know, it's still on. That's one of the festivals. We have a yearly festival, and they call it the. And what happens at the end of we have presentations, and there's a lot of fun, and come out, do their Bigfoot call, and then they present a winner. And so it became kind of a fun event, and ESPN came and covered it one time and stuff. So that would be in the last week of September, if it's still on. Other than that, we've got a book my brother and I have coming out, an atlas on mysteries of the Northeast here, on various phenomena, from the La Cabana type incidents to various creature incidents and so forth. And it really shows the broad array of Fortean type phenomena in this region. It's more like a brief atlas as opposed to an in-depth study. And you get to see, an introduction to the various phenomena that have been going on in this region. So we're just plowing away and we just continue to collect information. We're always collecting information and reports. The phenomena that occurs with the Bigfoot phenomena is definitely a consistent pattern of sightings that goes back to the Algonquin and the Iroquois to modern day, including sightings that happened in January of this year. So the sightings continue. And even though they aren't reported, because nowadays with social media, it used to be, I've been around this a long time, just as you have. And it used to be you had to go to the archives and go through microfiche. Oh my God, your eyes, you had to go just about blind, and you would go through news clipping services. And so that's where I'm coming from. That's what these filing cabinets behind me are full of, newspaper clips and reports. And the thing is that nowadays it's different. It's immediate, and it's social media reporting it. And there's drawbacks too. There isn't that large number of clippings and sightings reported in papers anymore. It's reported differently now. So
do you think that makes it harder to verify? Because before, if it went to the papers, you had to make that step to go public.
yeah,
Whereas now you just have to click a button and say, I saw something on a Facebook page, and you go through the rigmarole of finding out, and oftentimes it's very, very good, and sometimes not so much.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's better or not, but it's different.
Yes.
It's a completely different way to report things now. And coming from that era of microfiche and newspaper clips to the social media today, it's, I see drawbacks and positives. I can get to a sighting much quicker. And I think that's a huge positive, but you don't have that anchor base of information. You just have sort of maybe an intangible report without all that information that's already in existent print. So yeah, there's, you can look at it both ways, I suppose. Yeah. It's just the way it is, unfortunately.
I was just thinking when you said that, shorter but longer in a way, because you have to verify more. But then again, how would you check out the microfiche at this point in time? You couldn't leave the house and go and do it. At least you can do everything from your home or from your phone. I'll say goodbye to you, Paul. It's been a real pleasure. I mean, Scott's been telling me for ages, you have to speak to Paul. You have to speak to Paul. And I'm really glad I did. Pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure talking with you, and hope to talk to you again sometime.
Take care. Bye.
Take care.